Well, we left Gideon at the winepress, didn't we? Beating and threshing out his wheat. Orpa, in effect, with a stick. A stick down a winepress, right? Trying to get some corn to eat, right? Weakened and impoverished and representative of his nation. You see, this was a man and a nation completely and utterly under the grip of Midianite oppression. And they were all grappling with the question as to why God had allowed all of this to happen to his people. And we saw Yahweh take Gideon on a journey back through history. And for those that weren't with us in our last class, really, to give you the abbreviated version in 1 minute of what we covered in far too long, was the story of Shechem. You see, God sent a prophet quoting from Joshua chapter 24, the time when the nation of Israel had made a covenant to serve God, and there was a stone or a rock of witness that Joshua established at that time that would hear all the words that they had pronounced that they would speak, and a covenant that they made. And Joshua made a statute and an ordinance in Shechem and set that stone up there as a witness for them to serve God and not serve idols. And of course, Joshua brought them back to that spot because it was the spot that Jacob had taken his family's past when they were escaping Shechem and the destruction that they had taken out on Shechem and on Hamor and on Dinah's revenge on that nation, on that city. And Jacob, as he was running from their potential hostilities that would come from that moment, buried all the idols that Laban and his family, or that his family had stolen from Laban. And they buried their idols there to choose to serve God. And of course, that's what Joshua had brought them back there for, was to remember that they'd taken out of idolatry and to serve God. And of course, that was Jacob buries those idols under the oak that was in Shechem, because right next to that oak was the altar that Abraham had built. The altar that Abraham had first built when he arrived into the land, when God had called him from being an idolater to becoming a servant to God. And he built that altar on that spot in a dedication. And he comes to the land, and there he builds an altar. And of course, Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 and 7 says the Canaanite was then in the land. Interesting. And God and Abraham's making a choice not to serve the gods of the Canaanites, but to serve the God that had called him there in the first place. And all of this is captured in the concepts of Joshua, in the story of Joshua 24, when he says we need to remember that God brought you up out of the bondage of Egypt to establish you in an inheritance and to give you a land. And Joshua is drawing on the two stories to exhort the nation to flee from idolatry and to choose to serve God and to make a covenant, which they broke. And here at Shechem, Gideon's coming to understand the issues, that whilst the nation remained in idolatry, they would stay in bondage. Whilst they kept serving anyone other than God, God would leave them in the iron grip of Midianite oppression, that they might learn to trust him. And yet now, Yahweh looks upon Gideon in mercy. He inclined himself. He looked upon him, we saw in verse 14, in mercy, and instructs him in the same way as Moses had been instructed, to go in his might to save Israel from the hand or the bondage of Midianite oppression, and to come up out of Egypt just like God had done with Moses. And just as Moses had done all those years before, Gideon responded in exactly the same way, didn't he? Me? Whoa. Me? What? I can't do this, not me. Of course, Moses had tried that too, hadn't he? No, God says, no, you're the man for the job. I've asked you to do it. It's time to get on. And so God says to him, verse 16, Yahweh says to him in verse 16, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite Midian as one man. And so Gideon now realizes, so here's our proof, by the way, that Gideon now realizes that this whole story is the story of Moses all over again. And look in your margin, if you've got the Oxford Bible like I have, it says And Gideon says unto God, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. And if you've got your margin and the same as mine, it says, go and have a look under T, Exodus chapter 33 and verse 13. Oh, Gideon quotes what Moses had said in Exodus chapter 33. If now I have found grace in thy sight, show me a sign. And you see, Gideon says, God, you promised to Moses at the time of the burning bush that you would give Moses a sign, that he would take a sign and that he'd go back to his people to prove that God was with him. You'd have the rod that would turn into a serpent in front of them. You'd have a leprous hand that would be pure and then leprous and then pure again. And there was water into blood that gave evidence to the fact that you were God and that I was sent by you. I want a sign that you'll go with me. And so God's going to choose, just like he had with Moses, how he was going to reveal his glory. And at this point, Gideon's trust in God's mighty hand for deliverance was in its very infancy. As a brother once said down here just before, God's going to turn this warrior into a warrior, all right? And he's going to turn from an unsure, doubting Thomas, in a way, to becoming one that was utterly convinced that God would be with him. He needed proof, and he needed conviction that God would go with him. And I think we've all been here sometimes, haven't we, brothers and sisters, in times of our life? It is a lesson for us in Gideon's response, isn't there? We all sometimes encounter uncomfortable responsibilities. At times in our life, we can be asked to perform in ecclesia or in our families or responsibilities to take on roles and duties that we feel are utterly inept at doing or suitably unqualified for. It could be teaching others. It could be hospitality. It could be speaking here or there. It could be counselling or mentoring. It could be catering. It could be anything that we get asked to do. And God often asks us to do things and create circumstances for people to work outside of natural comfort zones and ability, doesn't he? Gideon felt no inclination at this point in time to stand up, grab a sword, and fight for his people. No inclination at all. In fact, he's hiding in a wine press. Yet God says, get cracking. Moses, by the time he'd spent 40 years on the backside of the desert in the wilderness, felt utterly inadequate. I can't go. And God got angry with him. Mate, I'm with you. Hurry up. Barak, in the story of Gideon and Barak, Deborah and Barak just before, was struggling with the enormity of his responsibilities and his calling. He couldn't handle it either. He was struggling. Jeremiah felt like a child when God asked him to do his job. Totally inexperienced, useless. See, the point, brothers and sisters, is that God asks us not just to perform the duties and the responsibilities that we might feel we naturally excel at, but he asks us to step forward and to serve where there is a need. And it may not be easy, and it may not be perfect, but we each need to trust, like the Apostle Paul did, we can do everything through Christ which strengthens us. You see, we each need to give as we've been given, not just in the areas that we feel we could or are good at. I don't know about you, but I often hear, and I ran Sunday school for a period of time, I asked every living person just about in our ecclesia to be able to teach. You know how many excuses I got for why you couldn't be a good Sunday school teacher? I don't think I can hear one. I don't think I can hear a new one, right? It's not my thing. It's not my calling. I just couldn't possibly do it. I don't have time. But we had a need in our ecclesia. We had 94 children to teach. There was a need. You see, Gideon and Moses and Jeremiah, tried to come up with the same excuses too? Did God let off the hook? Not likely. You think it's tough now, Jeremiah? Hey, mate, imagine when you're running with the horsemen. You think it's tough now? So whenever you hear yourself say, oh, it's not my thing, I just don't think I've got time, I just don't, it's not it's not what I'm good at. Have a think. Is there a need? God asks us to do jobs, not just because we're good at stuff, but because he can work with us and that he can help us do stuff. And it's his work that we're doing, not ours. What we're being taught is that to ask Yahweh to show us how we can serve and support his work and to serve in his ecclesias, we need to work with him in his way and how he wants things. Perhaps we need a little encouragement. Perhaps we need our ecclesial members to be a little bit less judgmental on when things aren't quite as perfect so that we can get more volunteers. We need to create safe places for people to step up. We need a lot more forgiving and understanding and being supportive of each other so that we can all serve together. You see, people retreat into shells to avoid conflict, which is a major contributor in ecclesial life as to why we don't get volunteers. So how do we change that? How do we make that a better place? We need to find in our ecclesias more opportunities for people to stand up and say, is there a need? Here am I, send me. Not here am I, send him. It doesn't work. Here am I, send him is a different place altogether. We need to be supportive of each other to inspire each other to serve. And so in receiving his commission, Gideon's first response is to turn around to God, isn't it? And to say, I need a sign. I need to know that you're going to be with me. I need to know, he says, verse 17, if thou I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Now, that poses another question for us in practice, doesn't it, brothers and sisters? Young people, when do we ask for signs? And when should we maybe not? When should we ask for signs and expect God to respond? Look, I'm really happy to talk through this afterwards with you and get your views and ideas on this, but here's some suggestions as to what comes out of the story of Gideon here and for us to think about when it comes to how God gives us signs when we ask for them and how he responds and why sometimes he may not respond. Now, I think the key to this question as to when we should or when we shouldn't ask God for a sign is to explore our motives. It lies in understanding why we're asking the question. Now, I believe too often, and certainly in my case, in our walk in the truth, we can be asking God for signs to prove that his blessings are on our choices, when in fact God might not respond at all. I've been guilty of this, asking God to show me whether I should apply for a job or accept a promotion or to take a different role or responsibilities. I've been guilty of that, but the truth of it was that every time I asked, it was because I wanted to know for me and my personal selfish choices. I wanted to know whether I could earn another 15 grand, not whether it was God's choice. By the way, I'm not saying that we shouldn't pray for God's blessing on our decisions. But when should we ask God for a sign, right? There's a difference between asking for God's blessing and asking for a sign to see or to get proof of whether this is the right decision or not, because sometimes he may respond, or sometimes he may not respond. James chapter 4, verse 3 says, Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye might consume it upon your own lusts. And I think what we're being taught by James is that to ask for Yahweh to show us how we can serve and support his ecclesia and to serve his ecclesia is not about us, but about us needing to understand how God will show us his way, not our way. And so I think we have to see it like this, brothers and sisters, is that Gideon doesn't say to God in verse 17 of Judges chapter 6, show me a sign that should tell me whether I should go or not. You see the difference in that question? If Gideon had said, show me a sign about whether I should go or whether I shouldn't, God may not have responded. But instead what he's saying is, I need additional support and confidence that if I go, you will be with me. I need to know that you'll be with me. He'd already made the choice to go. And he was wanting God to show him that he would be with him, that that was his choice and that God would be with him. And so perhaps if we ask for a sign, let's ensure we're not testing God for our own benefit, but seeking positive confirmation on serving him and others to fulfill his purpose, not our choice. And so the principles really is maybe we need to explore our motivations first. Why are we asking? Is there a request God-centered or self-questioned? Let's ask that literal question of ourselves first. There is a difference between asking for God's blessing and asking for a sign. And requests for sign generally should request support on how to achieve his purpose, not whether this is God's purpose. And that request for signs generally should not be about testing God to prove to us what his purpose is. Maybe that might be a helpful set of principles when we come to ask God for a sign. If we're moving in a direction, how do we know that God's going to be with us? So by this stage, Gideon thought he was talking with a prophet, not an angel. And so Gideon courteously turns around and wants to show his godly guest some honor. So he says this in verse 18, "Depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come again unto thee and bring forth my present and set it before thee." And so he said, okay, I'll tarry here until I come again. Do you know, Gideon has asked for a sign, and God's about to give him one. God's going to turn this present into a sign for Gideon, and it's going to be a sign that he's never probably seen before. He hasn't understood this sign. God's going to demonstrate to him a sign that shows him what this is all about. And he says, stay here until I bring forth my present to set it before thee. The word present there is the word for minkar. And under the law, there was a specific sacrifice. But by the time of the judges, it was merely a sacrificial gift given to honor a guest of honor. Right? It was there when Manoah says to the angel in Judges 13, verse 15, can I bring you a present? Right? It's a gift. I want to give you a gift. Right? And Gideon's saying, I want to show my commitment to God's request, and I want to show you honor. But wait here, I'll be back. And look what he goes and gets. And this is remarkable. Gideon says, went and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour. Now, I just want you to stop and think about this for a minute. You are 7 years into an impoverished state. You have no seed barely left to at least plant for next year's harvest. And he's beating out the sticks, is beating out the wheat as much as he's got and collected from wherever he can, just to have enough to be able to sustain life. And here he is, and he goes away, and he kills a kid, a goat, right? And an unleavened cakes. He makes unleavened cakes, an ephah of flour. Now, an ephah of flour is, we know from Numbers chapter 16, 10 omers, right? And 1 day's food for any normal Israelite when they were collecting manna in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 16 was 1 day's food. And 10 omers makes an ephah. So what he goes and does is he goes and he makes 10 men's food in unleavened cakes. Well, it's a lot of food. Well, it is for me anyway. All right? For Sarah, that's it. No, I won't say it. No. There's 10 men's food here for the day. All right? And a kid of the goats in a time of famine, a time when there was food scarcity. Bread for 10 men. Gideon's going to commit all to God for his purpose. He was all in on this. 10 being an aggregate number of the all. He brings it to be all in. We're going to see his 10 men in a minute in verse 27. Gideon comes with 10 men. Here he is. he makes food for his entire lot, 10 men's worth of food and a kid of the goats. Gideon was committing everything to God, and he sets it to and brings it to honor his guest. And I want you to notice the detail. So Gideon brings out his present. Look at all the detail that we're given in verse 19. The flesh he brought in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought it out under him, under the yoke, and presented it. I don't know about you, but that's an awful lot of detail, isn't it, for something? Why are we told that flesh was in this baskety thing over here, and the broth over here in a pot, and the unleavened cakes he put there? Well, why? What's the point? Well, the answer to it is this. Gideon had said, wait until I come and bring forth my present and set it before thee. Notice that? Set it before thee. If you've got a coloured pencil, when it says, I'm going to set it before thee, in verse 18, you link that word to verse 20 when the angel says, take the flesh and the unleavened cakes and set them upon this rock. Lay them upon this rock. That's exactly the same Hebrew word. What he's saying is, it's not going to be a present for me, Gideon. I want to set you my present, said Gideon. And the angel says, nah, take the flesh and the cakes, and I want you to lay them upon this rock and pour the broth out. What's the point, brothers and sisters? Well, perhaps we see it this way. And I confess, I sat there for hours thinking about this, looking at all the different options and combinations of what it could be or couldn't mean and types and all sorts of stuff. But I think the simplicity of it is this. Look at what he does. So he brought the flesh in a basket, the broth in a pot, and he lay it before the angel. And the angel says, I want you to take this. This is not a present for me. This is an offering for God. But notice the detail of how he brought and the actions the angel now wants to take. The present had come in different pieces. Notice that. Flesh in one thing, broth in another bit. Do you know what the angel does? The angel turns to Gideon and says, you're not getting what we're trying to achieve here. I want you to put all those pieces back together again. And we'll start again. Take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, put them on the rock, and pour the broth back on top of it. Put this whole thing back together again. What was wrong with what Gideon had done? What did God want him to understand? Well, perhaps the answer to that is what God does with the offering by the angel, instead of what Gideon had done with it himself. How had he cooked the offering? Well, we're told that effectively he brought the broth in a pot and the fish in a basket. What are we told by that? We're told that he boiled the offering. He boiled it to cook it. Naturally, it's the fastest way of cooking meat, isn't it? What does the angel do with the offering? It burns it with fire. What's the significance? The fire which comes out of the rock destroyed it. What's the point? Well, where do we come across a young animal of the flock, unleavened bread, and we're met by a person carrying a staff in their hand to cook for their entire household in the context of Moses and the coming out of Egypt? This is all going to be the sign that Yahweh is going to deliver his people from bondage. And the answer is that the angel is trying to teach them, don't worry about a present for me. Let's have a Passover meal. You want proof of that, brothers and sisters? We'll come back to Exodus chapter 12. Come and have a look at this, and perhaps maybe this might help us understand. Well, actually, yes, come. No, we don't have time. I've got it on the screen. It's all good. Here's God going to show Gideon the following things, right? So, well, actually, come back to Exodus 12. Who cares about the time? We'll be fine. Exodus chapter 12, we'll just speak faster. Exodus chapter 12, verse 5. Look at this. And I didn't realize this, but look what it says in verse 5. This is all of the story of the thing. You had to take your lamb, says verse 3, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house, right? And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him take his neighbour unto his house according to the number of the souls. Verse 4, every man according to his eating shall ye count for your lamb. So you had to have enough for your family, right? Notice this, and I never appreciated this. Your lamb shall be without blemish. A male of the first year shall you take it from the sheep or the goat. Now, I'd never seen that before. I'd never seen a goat offering in the context of a Passover. Perhaps now we've seen it for the first time. And look what it says. Your lamb will be without blemish. 1 year old could either be of the sheep or the goats. The lamb was according to the eating of their fathers. And we know Gideon brings food for 10 men. And we find 10 men with Gideon in the next, in verse 20, verse 27. He has 10 men of his servants which are going to help him remove the idols. All right? Gideon had prepared for his entire family. What did verse 9 say about that Passover offering? Eat not of it raw, nor sodden it all with water, but roast it with fire. So it was never allowed to be cooked by water. It had to be roasted by fire. It had to be eaten with unleavened bread. Well, that's no surprise with the story of Gideon. And nothing was going to remain until the morning, says verse 10. It had to be fully eaten and fully consumed by either eating it or by burning it with fire. And the angel is going to put forth the end of his staff in Judges chapter 6 and verse 21. And he's going to touch the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and a fire is going to come out of the rock and entirely consume the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And you had to eat it ready to roll. Your loins were girded, your shoes on your feet, and the staff was in your hand. And we're going to meet an angel who's holding a staff in his hand as he touches that offering. It's gone, and the angel disappears. I think, brothers, this is what we might be being told, is that the angel was saying to Gideon, if you're going to be Moses, and we're going to leave Egypt, and we're going to undo the bondage and the oppression that this nation has been under, the first thing we start with, Gideon, is a Passover offering that God will pass over you and will destroy the enemy. And you notice this? Gideon says, you ask for a sign. You want a sign that I'm going to be with you. You want a sign that I'm going to be there. Do you know, well, Exodus chapter 13 says this was going to be the sign, the Passover sign. This is exactly what the Passover was for the nation of Israel, and it was exactly what the Passover was going to be to Gideon. Exodus chapter 3 says, verse 8 and 9, thou shalt show thy son in this day, saying, this is done because of that which Yahweh did unto me when I came out of Egypt. And it was for a sign, the Passover meal, the sign unto thee upon thine hand, and for a memorial upon thine eyes, that Yahweh's law might be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath Yahweh brought thee out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 13, verses 8 to 9. The sign of the Passover was what was going to be requested by the nation, to see and to pass on from generation to generation, that God would be with them. Gideon says, I need a sign. God says, good question. I'll give you one. Here it is. And so Gideon grabs that offering. Put the whole thing back together again and let's start again. The angel says to him, take the flesh, verse 20, and the unleavened cakes, lay them upon this rock. Remember, I coloured that expression in this rock, this rock, this rock. So put them on this rock and pour out the broth on it. And he did so. And verse 21 says that the angel of Yahweh put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand. He touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and whoosh, out of the stone of witness to confirm God's sign that Gideon had requested, everything's consumed. It consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And the angel was gone. And Gideon all of a sudden realizes who he was talking to. The angel. He perceived, oh, I've seen God face to face. Gideon realizes that he's been talking to Yahweh's representative. And he fears for his life, but God says, don't panic. I've got you covered. Peace be upon thee. Verse 23. Yahweh says to him, peace be unto thee, fear not. You won't die. I've got you covered. Why? How did he know that he was not going to die? Well, that's the point of the Passover, that they might not perish with the angel of death. You're not going to die, Gideon. I've called you for a job. I'm not about to kill you. You'd be pointless with me dead. Let's get on with the job. What is Gideon's response? Oh, it's remarkable, isn't it? Then Gideon built an altar there unto Yahweh and called it Yahweh Shalom. Yahweh shall be peace. He built an altar, just like Abraham had. And it's there unto this day an offering of the Israelites. He built it there in response to God's willingness to be with him. And God says to him, that's good. It's good, Gideon. But we need to move that altar. We need to put that altar somewhere else. And verse 25, he tells him what he's got to do. So if the kit of Gideon's offering was a Passover, what was the very next thing that you did in the Jewish calendar on the 15th of April? You moved from the Passover into what feast or festival? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. And what did you do in the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Would you know what you did for the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Well, it was quite specific. So your Feast of the Passover was the deliverance from Egypt. The very next thing you would go into the Feast of Unleavened Bread was to celebrate that there might not be leaven in your house. It was a Feast of Unleavened Bread, that there might be no wickedness or any idolatry in your house. In Exodus chapter 12 says that 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your homes. For whosoever eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the generation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. You're not to touch or eat anything leavened. In all your habitations shall ye eat unleavened bread. It was a rule for the nation of Israel. Notice what verse 25 says. Come back to Judges chapter 6, verse 25. And it came to pass the same night, God says to him, you know that leaven purge? Let's have a crack. Take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath done, and cut down the grove that is by it, and build an altar unto Yahweh thy God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place. And take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. Oh, we're going to move that altar, Gideon. This is not the place of the altar. I want you to put it on this rock. We've got to get this back. We've got to get everything back on track. We've got to get the nation back to worshipping me. And the first thing you have to do, Gideon, is you have to get your house in order. We're going home. And it came because Gideon had to sweep, clean his father's house from all its leaven in its habitations, and in its place to build an altar unto Yahweh. He had already built that altar called Yahweh shall be peace, but Gideon needed to understand, and God is going to teach him, that the only way peace could be achieved was the entire removal and eradication of any leavenous idolatry, and in its place built the altar on top of that stone of witness, upon this rock, as a witness to the nation. That idolatry would be destroyed, that God might be worshipped, and it had to be in that order. And then and only then could they truly have peace. And so God commands Gideon to purge his household, to save the nation, to turn their hearts back to God. He would first have to start at home with his own family. And you know, I don't know about you, but your family is often your worst critics, aren't they? You know, when you do some work, the one person that's going to tell you exactly what's going on is your family, immediate family. right? And I'm going to get, no, it's not. Right? So that's exactly right. The first thing you have to do is you have to deal with family. And they're going to tell you exactly how they feel. And of course, Gideon's now going to have to venture into the thing that he feared the most. What was his family going to say? How is that going to happen? And so, his individual Passover offering had to be upgraded, didn't it? It was now no longer just enough to be just his little offering. This now had to be a representation of his family and his tribe. That was then going to become a national offering. And Gideon's going to be taught that what starts with you personally has to now affect those that are immediately around you to bring them on the journey. Before you could ever start a reform with the nation, you had to have your family on. And so his own kid is going to be upgraded to a bullock. This rock is going to be upgraded to an altar. And not just Gideon, but upgraded to his family to get on board. So what's the command? Verse 25. Well, take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it, and build an altar unto Yahweh thy God. You see, idolatrous worship at this time involved the worship of Baal and Asherah. And here it's depicted by the altar of Baal and the grove. And Baal was the altar, or represented as a god, the god of blessing and fertility. In summary, it was the sun. And they would worship Baal as the sun god who brought prosperity and good fortune. And Asherah was the god of the fun and pleasure, the moon, the worship of the moon, and she represented fun times. And so you would have good fortune and fun times by serving these two things. And God asks for these two gods specifically to be destroyed. The altar of Baal to be thrown down, the wooden statues and the poles of Asherah to be cut down, and in their place using the same materials to rebuild the altar of Yahweh and to make a sacrifice of a bullock of wood upon this thing. And it was to be done in an ordered place, says the record. It means to be arranged in a row, to be carefully arranged to make Yahweh's altar, to be arranged in the way that he would like it appointed. So what was to be offered? Well, he says, take thy father's young bullock, even the bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar. Is there two bullocks or one? Many commentators have tried to work this out, and the best answer I suppose I can come forward with, basically trying to summarize some of those thoughts, is that actually there is only one bullock that gets offered. And here's the suggestion as to why. So there's a bit of conjecture, but I believe there's only one. And I think there's only one, and if there is only one, why would you refer it to as the second bullock? Well, perhaps customary practice might help us unlock this issue. You see, bullocks were most often yoked together in pairs. They'd usually be yoked together for about 3 or 4 years to plough and to work together over this time until they were about 7 years old. And so you would, after 7 years, you would uncouple it and you would fatten it up in the paddock for a year or two and then sell it on or kill it for meat. But what we would usually do is you would usually yoke an older animal with a very young one. And the purpose was that the older animal would train the younger bullock to learn what to do. The older bullock, even though he's still called a young bullock because he's still new at what he was doing, the older bullock was known as the second bullock because it was more experienced. The second bullock is therefore the experienced one. And so who was the second bullock? Well, it represented Joash and his family, you see. Gideon had to realize that God needed him to decouple Joash's yoke from idolatry and to hook it up to Gideon's yoke, that together they might change the nation and its history. He had to uncouple him from idolatry and the worshipping of Baal and Asherah to the even younger bullock being Gideon, who was going to cut the yoke of idolatry and connect it to him and his father's house together, that they might plough the nation and to turn their hearts back to God. And together they would serve Yahweh on the altar of the stone of witness, Yahweh Elohim of their fathers. All right? But Gideon's faith and trust is still fledgling in its fledgling state. And whilst he knew what God had wanted, and whilst he knew that God was with him now because God had given him the sign, he was still fearful about what might happen. He still feared, and he was scared stiff. He was scared stiff of two things. Two things. What were the two things he was scared stiff of? Verse 22. 27. Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as Yahweh had said unto him. And it was because he feared his father's household and the men of the city that he would not do it by day, but he did it by night. What were the two things he was fearful of? He was fearful, firstly, of his father's household. And he was also fearful, secondly, of the men of the city. He was worried about what his family would do to him, and he was worried about what the men of the city might react like. And so with the help of 10 men, by the middle of the night, he goes about to execute that night on what God had requested him to do. Do you know what, brothers and sisters, young people, do you know what Gideon's name means? Gideon's name means a hewer down. A hewer down, a feller, F-E-L-L-E-R. He was going to drop things. That is what he was going to be. And no matter how much of a mighty man of valor or a mighty warrior he could be to cut down humans and enemies of God, the first thing God commands him to do is you go and cut down the idolatry. You can't release bondage and oppression if you still have idolatry. The first thing you need to do is you need to start. Jen, there's some big lessons for us in that, isn't there? You know, God's judgments are going to begin where? Well, God's judgments begin at the house of God, says 1 Peter chapter 4. The Levites were commanded in Exodus 32 to deal with the matters of their brethren first before they dealt with the matters of their family. The mote and the beam story of Matthew chapter 7 means you deal with the things in your own eye before helping others. To inspire others requires us to start at home, in our own backyard. To help others in the truth, we first have to get our own lives and hearts sorted out. We can't help anybody otherwise. But what that does is that our example either inspires people or it corrupts them. There's no other alternative. Our example in our walk only either inspires or turns people away from us. But the first thing we have to do is we have to overcome idolatry in ourselves before we truly could help each other. But what is idolatry? How does this work? And look, we've had many talks in many different places on what idolatry is and isn't. And they're all relevant. But what is idolatry in today's context? You see, if the heart, we don't have altars and we don't have groves like they had back then, but the heart of ancient biblical idolatry focused on two key areas. And just think about this for a minute. Happy to discuss this later. But there was the worship of prosperity and the worship of pleasure. Those are the two things, in essence, that were the major problems in the society at the time of Israel. And don't tell me that they are not the two issues today. I think if we put it that way, the God of prosperity and the God of pleasure, perhaps we can see things in a little bit more relevancy as to how these two gods are an issue for us. You see, the desire to have more and the desire to have fun are the two issues of today. The pursuit of these things becomes a self-process of self-reliance and self-gratification and selfishness, and they drive us away from God, and we fail to see God's gifts. The pursuit of these things trap us and ensure us that we don't understand that we're actually even trapped in ourselves. And it doesn't matter what age we are. These issues are a problem for every generation. Do you know how we're affected, or we know that we're affected by idolatry today? Ephesians 5, verse 5, don't turn it up, says, idolatry is covetousness. Right? How are we affected by covetousness? Ephesians 5, verse 5. How are we affected by it? Ezekiel 33 says, we listen to the God's word, but we fail to do anything about what we're told. That's how we know we've got a problem with covetousness, is we hear the words, but we don't do them. Ezekiel 33. So just think about last week's exhort, midweek Bible class. What have you changed as a result of what you've heard? And if the answer to that is nothing, the question you have to ask yourself, and myself, is why not? If we're truly honest with ourselves, it's because other things are more important, or have shouted louder, or have received our attention than the things we're being requested by the scriptures to change. It's quite simple. Our heart hasn't been able to be shaped because it's bricked by something else. So how do we combat that? How do we actually change to be more like God? How do we combat the issues of idolatry? Well, first we have to be like Gideon. We've got to be made aware of the problem and seek to break down and cut down the things that stand in our way, whatever they are. I'm not going to tell you what they are, because they could be anything for you. But focusing on stuff that chases prosperity, money, wealth, more family, are things that can sometimes change us away from God and his view. Things that seek our pursuit for pleasure and entertainment rather than fellowship and friendship in the truth are problems. You know what they are? I need to tell you. But we have to start creating memories in the truth. We have to start creating experiences. We have to try to serve God and serve others. They're the secrets to overcoming idolatry, that our hearts might be changed so that we can become more like God. That's, in a nutshell, the problem. So let's think about becoming like Gideon. We have to make active choices to remove things that make us selfish, to learn to become more like God. And if we don't replace the things we smash, we just go back to them. So we've got to create new things. We make active choices to try and dedicate our time and energy to God to serve him. It can be daunting. It might be challenging. We could be worried about what things look like. It could be impacts on others. But we first have to start at home, that God's altar may be rebuilt, that the nation can be inspired. And you know, we might be surprised that when we do make changes, that we can inspire others. Do you know what? That's exactly what happened for Gideon. See what it says. Verse 28. When the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by, and the second bullock offered on the altar that was built. And they said one to another, who's done this thing? And when they inquired, they said, well, Gideon the son of Joash. And so the men of the city wanted to kill him. But what does his family do, brothers and sisters? Do you know what his family do? Instead of losing his father's household, he gains them. He builds their respect and gains them back. Instead of upsetting them, he inspires them. So when the men of the city inquired, then they realized that it was Gideon, the son of Joash, had done it. They marched up, the men of the city marched up with hostile intent to demand Joash, in verse 30, to bring your son out that he may die. Bring him out. We're going to kill him for what he's done. It was the men of the city's response. Gideon's actions now, all of a sudden, change Joash. Joash now is inspired to act. Look what he does. Joash emerges from this circumstance an entirely different man. Firstly, he's going to stand against the men of the city to choose not to deliver Gideon over. And secondly, he's now inspired to fight for Gideon's cause. And he does so with devastating logic. Look what he does. The emphasis is on the word ye, isn't it? Verse 30. Who verse 31, Joash says unto all that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death, whilst it is yet the morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Who are you, says Joash? Can't Baal fight for himself? You know, whoever's going to fight for Baal, seeking to avenge the destruction of his altar, I'll knock him out first. If you're going to try and touch my boy, I'm going to kill you first. So, but let's wait until tomorrow, and if we'll give Baal time to avenge the insult he's received, and if he's even a god, then let's see him fight for himself. That's what it really means, isn't it? You're going to try and take Gideon out, I'll kill you myself. But let's just wait till tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. Just to how much of a Baal god he really is. Joash is now standing fully beside his son, yoked in the harness, and he renames him. Notice he doesn't even wait till the next day to rename him. It said, let's wait till tomorrow. Gideon, he names Gideon that day. Verse 32, therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him. Jerubbaal, let Baal plead. And Joash does this, and in so doing he sets Gideon up as a living witness and a testimony to the fact that Baal couldn't exist. That as long as Gideon lived, Baal didn't. It's quite simple. It was devastating logic from Joash, wasn't it? As long as Gideon lived, he proved Baal's ineffective and farcical existence, and that Yahweh indeed was the only God. So, brothers and sisters and young people, instead of upsetting his father and his father's household, do you know what he did? By his example and courageous stand for his God, he inspired a change in them. And when the battle came, they were the first ones to respond. When he blew his trumpet, who were the first ones to respond? It says, verse 34, Abiezer was gathered unto him. His father's family came to him first. And that's the lesson. The lesson for us is this, that our courageous and positive example to stand up for the things that matter in the truth will ultimately and positively inspire others who might themselves be wanting to change but are struggling to follow what was required. And often it's the people we least expect that can be inspired, can't it? But to enable ourselves to lead in this way, we firstly have to start looking in our own backyard. We have to start at home. We have to start with our own heart. We have to cut deep into our own family's experiences to try and explore what we're trying to do, explore our motivation, deal with the idolatrous clutter that sits in our heart first, so that once we've cut that out and thrown these things down in ourselves, and that God then becomes the center and focus of everything that we do, that maybe then we might have a chance to inspire others to serve Him. So let's try and be Gideons and to start at home to help each other.